idle wind. Liberal contention that the whole nation is guilty of murdering the president is a gratuitous insult. The heat of political conflict had nothing to do with the fact that a communist shot Mr. Kennedy. The only known social contacts of Communist Oswald and Dallas were with liberals. Liberals, however, are making tremendous effort to capitalize on this assassination. The fact that President Johnson, in his first legislative demands, played upon the overall emotions of the nation, create anxiety that he may continue in this vein in 1964. What we already know is that Mr. Johnson has more consistently supported the programs of totalitarian liberalism than any previous president. Constitutional conservatives, however, have been proved right and have nothing to be defensive about. They must now rededicate themselves to victory for their cause. That is a summary of my report on the idle wind. The full report after a message from my sponsor. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, the universal refrain in liberal pronouncements was, one, that political conservatives were primarily to blame because the communists shot the president. Two, that Dallas should bear a special burden of guilt. And three, that the whole nation was at fault for creating an atmosphere which encouraged a communist to kill. All of this is nonsense and a gratuitous insult to the nation. The heat engendered by political conflict between liberals and conservatives had nothing to do with the fact that a communist murdered our president. If there is any connection between a national attitude and the murder of President Kennedy, those involved in that connection are liberals. For years, liberals have maintained that communists are not dangerous and have sneered at conservative hysteria about communism. Attorney General Robert Kennedy has been particularly blunt and vocal in this regard. In the fall of 1961, Attorney General Kennedy invited Walter Reuther to submit recommendations about controlling and silencing the radical right. Reuther recommended that radical rightists be declared subversive. According to Reuther, a basic fallacy of the radical right, the main reason why conservatives are dangerous and should be declared subversive, is their overemphasis on the dangers of domestic communism. Concerning the general liberal allegation that Dallas environment somehow caused a communist to murder the president, it is noteworthy that Dallas homes which Lee Harvey Oswald is reported to have visited were homes of liberal intellectuals. The only meeting that Oswald is known to have attended in Dallas was a meeting of the American Civil Liberties Union at Southern Methodist University, less than a month before the assassination. The ACLU meeting, incidentally, featured a film portraying the evil of right-wing extremism in the state of Washington, where in 1962 a state representative was defeated for re-election because right-wingers disclosed the fact that the representative's wife allegedly had once been a member of the Communist Party. If the president had been murdered by a maniac who claimed to be a John Bircher or a racial segregationist, the vigilantes of liberalism would really be stalking the land. But the president was murdered by a communist. Though this fact seems particularly disconcerting to liberals, it has not kept them from capitalizing on the event. On November 29, United States Representative Richard Bowling, a liberal Democrat from Missouri, demanded that seniority privileges on committees be denied all Democrats who refuse to support all policies and candidates of the National Democrat Party. Bowling called Southern conservatives subversives and quislings. United States Representative Harry R. Shepard, a liberal Democrat from California, predicted that a chastened Congress, sobered by the assassination of the president, would probably pass the Kennedy civil rights and tax cut proposals before the end of the year. That was the appeal that President Johnson made. In his speech to a joint session on November 27, President Johnson urged Congress to honor the late president by passing his civil rights and tax bills. While pleading for harmony and national unity and the elimination of hate and bitterness, the president urged hasty action on legislation which many regard as divisive and hate-inciting. On November 26, the Month Bill came to a vote in the Senate. The bill was not intended to prevent sales of wheat or other commodities to communist nations, but to require cash payments from communists, it being a matter of historical record that granting credit to communists is the same as making them outright gifts, since they never pay us what they owe. 8 days before the assassination, the Senate had adopted the basic provisions of the Month Bill. 4 days after the assassination, when the Month Bill came up in final form, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield read to the Senate a letter from the deceased president urging defeat of the bill. It was defeated. Liberals are also using the president's assassination as the propaganda weapon for federal anti-gun laws, which violate a fundamental right of the people to keep and bear arms, which can never be effective in keeping guns from criminals, and which in calmer times the people and the Congress steadfastly opposed. To date, the most distressing example of liberal efforts to capitalize on the murder of our president is in Louisiana. Before the assassination, the governor's race in Louisiana was already intense. Some candidates were running on an anti-Kennedy platform. Others were known supporters of President Kennedy. No candidate was expressing hatred of President Kennedy, but the Kennedy administration was the predominant issue. Astute observers felt that an anti-Kennedy candidate was bound to win because among the people of Louisiana there was tremendous opposition to practically all New Frontier programs. Following the assassination, liberals allegedly converted the Louisiana political race into a hate campaign. According to reports, supporters of liberal candidates ran ads in newspapers saying that a vote for an anti-Kennedy candidate would be an endorsement of the Dallas tragedy and a condemnation of the lawful processes of government. The fact that Mr. Johnson, in his first major speech as president, played upon the overwrought emotions of Congress and the people creates anxiety that he, too, in 1964, may try to make political capital of the assassination. We must wait to see about this. What we already know is that, insofar as they can be compared, voting records in the Senate reveal that Senator John F. Kennedy voted more conservatively than Senator Johnson. The nation has cause for concern because President Johnson will cater to left-wing union bosses and Negro leaders more than any previous president. President Kennedy, indelibly identified as an Eastern liberal, had the foregone support of union bosses and Negro leaders regardless of what he did. Almost in the same way that the Democrat Party for a long time had a political brass collar on the solid South. Johnson, being a Texan, identified with oil and cattle, still feels a need to prove himself with Negro and Union leaders, despite his consistent support of all major programs advocated by Negro organizations and unions. It is significant that one of the first telephone calls Mr. Johnson made as president was to David Dubinsky, head of the Ladies' Garment Workers Union, a powerful political figure in extreme left-wing labor circles. Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins, extremist left-wing Negro leaders, were among the first non-governmental persons whom President Johnson invited to the White House for conferences. In less than 3 years, opposition to the Kennedy administration had mobilized conservative forces of America. If President Kennedy had lived, and if conservatives had found a candidate, in Goldwater or someone else, to stand squarely on constitutional grounds and directly oppose every major policy of the New Frontier, the elections of 1964 could have been a magnificent example of the American democratic process. Well-informed conservatives had no doubt about the outcome of such an election. Public opposition to Kennedy administration programs had already reached the proportions of a major political revolt, and was growing fast. The voters of America would have rejected the New Frontier. The late president had become the primary symbol of the coming political struggle. On the one hand, he was the foremost leader of liberalism. On the other, he was the arch political foe of conservatism. With the symbol now become a martyr, and with the forces of liberalism using the martyrdom for political gain, the picture is confusing. The confusion will be compounded by President Johnson, who, despite his record, has already convinced many that he is a moderate conservative. This fact has prompted liberal Republicans to intensify their campaign against Senator Goldwater in favor of some moderate like Nixon. If Republicans want to win the presidency in 1964, they had better nominate a constitutional conservative. Johnson will make any other kind of Republican opponent look foolish. The murder of a president has emphatically proved the correctness of a basic conservative stand, namely that communists are dangerous in the United States and should be made to obey the laws of the land. Frenzied liberal efforts to capitalize on the assassination prove that the educational work of constitutional conservatives is changing the climate of public opinion. Conservatives should redouble their educational efforts and rededicate themselves to the objective of victory for their cause now. The time is now to end the moratorium on discussions of vital issues. Conservatives have nothing to be defensive or apologetic about. What a tremendous advantage this gives them. There is no terror in your threats, for I am armed so strong in honesty that they pass by me as the idle wind, which I respect not. Those are words from a patriot of ancient Rome. They are words to be remembered by the conservative patriots of America in our time. I am Dan Smoot. Goodbye. God bless you. For the documented text of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 435, The Idle Wind. 6 copies, $1.